Yes, now.
Okay. Thank you for joining me today to celebrate the legacy of James Buchanan Elmore and the work of Ronald Baker. I want to thank you for coming. I want to thank my family and friends who have driven in from other places. I want to thank the people from Crawfordsville that are here. And I especially want to thank the Elmore family at this front table. Let's give them all a hand. They are here to celebrate your great-grandfather. Is that correct? Or grandfather? Great-grandfather, great-great-grandfather.
Depends what generation you're talking
Yeah, right. Anyway, we got a whole bunch of you here. Anyway, and that's just really nice. So I'm delighted to meet you. A few weeks ago, I was watching a PBS special. It was a Ken Burns special, and it was about Ken Burns specials. And Ken Burns was saying how much he just loves combing through dusty archives and how he loves going through boxes of old pictures from people's attics and how he loves reading journals that were written a long time ago. And he also said how important he thought this was, that we know about the past and the people's lives from the past, because all that informs what we are and what we do and what we think today. And it reminded me of something that Ron said back in the spring of 2023. He was working on this book, James Buchanan Elmore, and he said, you know, I don't know if anybody else cares about this, but I just love doing it. And I think we should all care about it for a number of reasons. And the first reason I think we should care about it is that James Buchanan Elmore was a significant part of a vibrant Hoosier literary heritage. Now, you don't hear that said a lot. You know, everybody thinks of writers as California or New York, maybe, or Southern Gothic or something, but there's been a long history of good writers here, and Elmore was a part of that. He was a very, very interesting man. The more I read about him, the more interesting he got. He was a good-looking man, and if you look at the picture in the book, or the big picture that I think your family gave to the library, he was a handsome man. He was a man who loved his family. He was a man that loved his farm, and he had a big farm that he farmed very successfully for all his life. And he did it with horses, right? It wasn't with machinery, or with power machinery. He had horses. And, you know, farming like that is a year-round, hard-working job. He was also a successful school teacher for like 20 years. And I'm somebody that taught school for 34 years, and I can tell you that's a hard job too. So, and additionally, he was a man who was very much involved in community affairs. He ran for office, maybe more than once. He was friends with a lot of important politicians and community leaders. But he was a man who always identified himself as a poet. He didn't identify himself so much as a farmer or a school teacher. He had identified himself as a poet. And I want to read you the epitaph off his gravestone. And it says, "Here lies beneath this marble stone a bard that loved in fields to roam, traveling paths many have trod, seeking the favor of his God." And so he thought, despite everything else he did, that poetry was the most important thing that he did. And he was very well known as a poet and as a lecturer, and he traveled around giving public performances of his work. And you will think back in those days, he was, what, this very rough from 1890 to 1920. He was really popular in Indiana, and he, this was a time when there were no movies, there was no television, there was no radio. People went to theater performances and concerts and Chautauquas and vaudeville, but a lot of entertainment was provided by writers who traveled around and gave readings and lectures about their poetry. James Whitcomb Riley very famously did this. He was one of his contemporaries. And Riley, well, Little Orphan Annie made him $6 million, I read, with which he endowed the Riley Foundation and Riley Children's Hospital. So we can thank Little Orphan Annie for lots of help for children. And Mark Twain did this too. Have any of you folks seen Hal Holbrook's Mark Twain Tonight? I saw it at Rose Holman in Terre Haute and in person, and I've seen it on TV. It was a great show, I gotta say. It was funny and touching and wry and had all the elements. But Elmore did this too, just like the other writers of his time. He apparently was very dramatic and theatrical. He appeared on stage often with a big black cape and swirled. And if I'd had a black cape, I would have worn it today. And so he was really popular, and he was also asked to write poetry for special occasions. He sort of did poetry on demand, you know, like, well, we want to dedicate this church. Well, Jim Elmore, will you write us a poem for this? Or we're gonna have this new bridge ribbon cutting, write a poem for that. Apparently, sometimes he even went someplace and they'd look around and say, oh, Jim Elmore's here, give us a poem for this. And he would just off the cuff recite a rhyme, like we would call that slam poetry today, right? And he loved doing this. He writes in one place that he was driving his team home some night in the dark, and he had to pull over to the side of the road and write down this poem he had just thought of, because he couldn't write while the horses were jiggling the wagon, you know. So this kind of consumed a lot of his thinking and his time, and he obviously loved doing it. So he had poems published in a lot of newspapers, and there were a lot of write-ups about his performances in the newspapers. He was written up not only in the Indianapolis papers and the Terre Haute papers, but also the Chicago papers and the Louisville papers, and the New York Times wrote about him too. So his notoriety was spread around a lot more than what people might think now. He wrote some fiction, but mostly it was poetry. He claims that fiction was just kind of not his genre that much. But sometimes people didn't receive him really well either. He was not a classical or an academic poet. He wasn't like Whittier or Walt Whitman or Longfellow that went right before him. And so sometimes people didn't appreciate him or take him that seriously. I want to read you something. This is something that was written about him when he was in 1937, when he was 80 years old, almost as old as I am now. and it appeared in a newspaper. It says, at the age of 80, Elmore was still a, quote, good farmer, unquote, and a shrewd businessman. Tall, mustached, heavy cloth cap, and Arctic splashed with rippling mud. He looks like a plain dirt farmer, not at all like the conventional figure of a poet. As a Crawfordsville resident remarked, if one were out gunning for poets, Jim would never be in danger. So he was a man of the people and a man of his time. Jesse Green, who was at that time the editor of the Crawfordsville newspaper, sort of christened him the Bard of Alamo in jest, I think. But that's really a pretty accurate title. He wasn't an academic poet. he was a bard of the times, like the old time bards, that he told stories about the people around him and the events around him. And Ron thought his two best poems were one, The Monon Wreck, and if you know about that, it was an incident on a railroad accident on the Monon, I think just north of Crawfordsville. Is that correct? Yeah. And apparently killed a lot of people, including some vaudeville players that had been in Crawfordsville shortly before. The other one was Pearl Bryan's Fate. Now, I don't know if any of you heard of Pearl Bryan, but that was a notorious murder case. A girl from Greencastle who foolishly fell in love with a med student and got pregnant, and he and his buddy took her to Louisville and killed her, cut off her head and hands, and dumped the body in the Ohio River, thinking she would never be identified. Well, she was wearing shoes or clothing or something from a store in Greencastle, and they tracked her down that way, and those guys were caught. But that was in all the newspapers of the time. There were songs and ballads and stories and performances and everything about Pearl Bryan. I think her tombstone in Greencastle had been chipped away numerous times, by souvenir seekers and all that. And so he wrote a long poem about Pearl Bryan, and that was very popular too. So he was a vibrant part of a vibrant literary heritage here. And if you think about it, this literary heritage includes Lew Wallace from here in Crawfordsville, James Whitcomb Riley from Indianapolis, Edward Eggleston from Vevay, Booth Tarkington from Indianapolis, Max Ehrman and Theodore Dreiser from Terre Haute, Gene Stratton Porter from up in the swamp somewhere, I'm not sure where that was, Kurt Vonnegut from Indianapolis, Mary Evans from Indianapolis, Philip Jose Farmer from Terre Haute, and mine and Jill's friend, Howard Andrew Jones, is a current writer in Indiana. He writes fantasy fiction, The Chronicles of Hanover, the Ringsworn trilogy, and The Chronicles of Sword and Sand, and a bunch of other things. He's a kind of a fantasy writer and fantasy fiction, and that's very popular now. There's a second reason that we should value the work, I think, of James Buchanan Elmore. He was a literary ethnographer. In other words, he described the culture he lived in. He was, as folklore say, a participant observer. He was a part of that culture. And he wrote about the time he lived in and the people he lived with. He showed us what the customs and beliefs and the lives of his time and his father's time were. He talked about the pranks, the work bees, the dances, the local music, what school was like, and what the basic lives of all these people in Central Indiana were. He especially showed us what Indiana life was like in small towns during and just after the Civil War. And if we think maybe our society is politically polarized now, think what it must have been then. Indiana had lots and lots of Southern sympathizers. One of the things that interested me was that Thomas Elmore, who was James Buchanan's uncle, right? And I think perhaps maybe James's father too, although he doesn't explicitly say so, were conductors on the Underground Railroad. And as you guys know, the Underground Railroad kind of came up the Wabash and through Fountain counties and Montgomery County and on up to Michigan and thence to Canada. And so these men who worked with that put themselves and their families in danger to help people escape from the South. And so he, unlike a lot of chronicles of the time, he names names and places and addresses. He tells where they hid him and how they hid him and how people were costumed and how they moved people from place to place. And he tells this all in stories not as history, but as stories, so you feel the empathy for the people. You understand how those people felt. And I think that's an important and significant part of the history of this area. It was dangerous work in a dangerous time. And once again, as Ken Burns pointed out, we can see how that past has shaped all of our lives today. And I think that's important things that happened in Indiana that we all need to recognize. There's several people I want to thank today, people without whom this book would never have been written or never have been published. And the first of these is Deli Craig. She's sitting right back there. She's the local history specialist here at this library. This is a lovely library, by the way. And without her, this book would not have been written, because she provided Ron access to materials that do not circulate, that you cannot use outside this library. And because of that, he was able to come up here and work with materials she provided and to put this book together. I also want to thank Nolan Eller. I don't think he is here. I don't know. He was with the Wabash, he's the Wabash College archivist, and he also provided materials for Ron's work. And finally, I want to say a huge thanks to Dr. Simon Bronner. Simon Bronner is a well-known scholar of folklore and folkloristics. He's the Dean of the College of General Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. He wanted to be here with us today, but he is in England giving a talk at the University of Oxford, maybe as we speak. He's a longtime friend and colleague of Ron's and mine, and without him, this book would not have been published. Ron finished this book 2 weeks before he died, and but Simon did all the electronic transfer of it that was required by the press. He wrote the foreword to it, and he also connected me with Lexington Press to help us get this done. So I want to thank Simon profusely, and then I'd like to make a couple of presentations here. So first, William Hauser, Dean Rush, Mrs. Bob Elmore, Janet, would you guys want to come up here? I have books for you. Deli Craig, will you step up here, please? I want to present a book to your permanent collections for this library. Thank you. And I also want to present a donation to this library in appreciation of all your help.
Thank you very much.
And I want to present Ron's files that he used to write this book for your archives. And so that I'm going to leave all the heavy stuff with you. I want to thank you all for coming today. It's nice to see you. It was fun to meet you. I have some books for sale. I'm sorry you got yours from Amazon for an egregious price. Yeah. So if you want another one, you know, I got another one. Anyway, so we have a lot more food left. Please visit, have some food, look at the books, ask me questions. Do you have any questions? I don't know. Does any of you have a question?
How much is your books for buying?
For buying from me, it's $35.
Okay.
It's more if you call the press. So they give me a discount. So, you know, so I'm passing the discount on. So.
Just curious, I'll probably have some extras.
Okay, all right, we can do that. Are there any other questions? Yes, sir.
How did your husband find out about him?
Ron,
Was he a
Ron's,
Wabash graduate? Right?
no, he was not. Ron has a bachelor's and master's Ron's career was interesting. He had a bachelor's in business administration from ISU, master's in philosophy, and then he has a PhD in folklore from Indiana University in Bloomington. And so he's written quite a number of books. This is his 11th book. They were, all but one were about Indiana folklore, Indiana place names. He was also a place name scholar. And his best-selling book was Hoosier Folk Legends, published 40 years ago exactly this year from IU Press. And that one has been very popular and is in most of the libraries. It may even be here, I don't know. Then he did a number of place name books. There is one other book he wrote that has not been published yet. It's with the Indiana Historical Society. It's a history of Indiana place names. It's more of a reference work. It's not really something that the ordinary guy would buy off the shelf, you know. And that has not been published yet. It may end up being only published electronically at some point. But most of his work focused on Hoosier folklore and place names.
I would add something to that.
Yeah.
That he had a career-long interest in figures like Elmore. His doctoral
Correct.
dissertation was on a similar figure from Vermont, Ronald Robinson, who was
Right.
also a kind of regional literary writer and artist also. Wasn't
Yes.
he drew illustrations to go with the stories, collected local legends from the community, was also a farmer, similar figure from the New England region. So he had a lifelong career-long interest in figures like this, and a desire to kind of bring them to the fore so that people would
Remember
be
them.
aware of them.
Yeah,
Because if
yeah.
you go and take a literature class, you're gonna get the canonical thing,
Mhm.
and you're gonna miss all these other people who are out there doing important work as well.
Right. Yeah, this is my daughter Jill Baker.
Oh, yeah. That's why I know this stuff.
She grew up listening to this. Yes, Ronald Robinson was the first book he published. It was his doctoral dissertation also, and he was a Vermont writer, right around the same time as Elmore, like around 1900.
Yeah,
He had been an artist and illustrator for many magazines until he went blind. And when he lost his eyesight, he began to write stories, and he wrote them on a wooden board with grooves so he could feel to write in a line. And then his wife typed and transcribed all of his work. And so, so that was the first one. He also did a book. It was really an edition of letters by Jesse Stewart. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Jesse Stewart. He was a man from Kentucky, but he had lots of friends in Indiana, but he was a man who celebrated the common man and was a school teacher and a school superintendent for many, many years, and wrote a lot of short stories that were very popular in anthologies. Back in the 50s, my mom and dad were high school teachers, and they both used Jesse Stewart's stories in their classes in high schools in the 40s and 50s. So that was one of his works too. Any other questions? Comments? I would like to hear from some of you Elmore people about stories about James Buchanan Elmore. Do you have any good stories you'd like to share? I know I caught you off base here, but yeah, off guard.
Well, my grandfather Albert
Mhm.
was his son, and when Albert bought his first car, James B. said he's gonna kill his whole family.
You want to go back to those horses and buggies, right? Yeah, right, yeah. Cool. You got any other stories? I'm sure there's some floating around there somewhere, you know, but I've been excited to get to know James Buchanan Elmore, and I'm proud of him as a fellow Hoosier, and I thank you all for coming today. We've got books that is for sale if you want a book. There's a lot of food and you might as well have a bunch of that.
Hmm.
So, thank you, appreciate it.